Self-confidence can't be forced. It doesn't come from tricks, from being loud, or from other people's opinions. It arises the moment you stop basing your life on the judgment of the outside world and start being honest with yourself. This isn't a technique, it's a decision. And it starts now. The Stoics knew this 2,000 years ago. While others sought applause, they worked on themselves. While others craved approval, they cultivated inner clarity. This audiobook isn't a guide to acting, it's a roadmap back to yourself, to what truly lies within you when you stop hiding it. In the following chapters, you will learn how to realign your inner voice, use your body as an ally, understand preparation as freedom, and remain steadfast with stoic clarity in every situation. Not for others, for yourself. So let's begin. Welcome to Stoic Vision, your channel for serenity, inner strength, and stoic wisdom. Subscribe now and activate notifications so you don't miss any inspiration. Feel free to leave us a short comment. We read everything. Chapter 1. The Voice Within You. How your inner dialogue shapes your appearance. There's a conversation you're having without ever speaking aloud. A conversation that never ends. It runs in the background of your everyday life, accompanying every decision, every conversation, every moment when you could reveal yourself, and perhaps withdraw instead. This is your inner dialogue, and it's more powerful than any speech you'll ever give. Epictetus, one of the most important Stoic philosophers, formulated it more clearly than almost anyone else. It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about them. These opinions don't begin in conversation with others. They begin within you. The moment before you open your mouth. The instant you assess a challenge, even before it has truly begun. Imagine you walk into a room full of people. Your inner dialogue tells you you don't belong here. The others know much more than you do. You seem insecure. These thoughts aren't facts, but your body treats them as such. Your shoulders hunch, your feet becomes quieter, your gaze searches the floor. You haven't said anything yet, but you've already positioned yourself as someone who is making themselves small. Now the opposite. Same room, same people, but your inner dialogue is different. I am prepared. I know what I have to say. I am here for a good reason. Your body responds immediately. You breathe more deeply. You straighten up. Your gaze becomes calm and open. Even if you have said a word, your posture radiates confidence. This isn't magic, this is neurobiology, and it's entirely in your hands. You can learn to have your inner dialogue, not by reciting positive mantras you don't believe, but by starting to treat yourself like a respectful mentor. A mentor who is honest with you, but who never puts you down, who names flaws without making them your identity. A Stoic thought that helps here. Observe your thoughts, but don't identify with them. You are not the doubt that runs through your mind. You are the one observing it. And whoever observes can also decide. Decide whether to believe a thought or let it go. Start with small moments. When you're faced with a task that intimidates you, begin consciously asking yourself, what am I really thinking right now? Is this a fact or an assumption? Would I say the same thing to a good friend that I'm saying to myself? These questions interrupt the automatic pattern, and in this interruption lies the space for growth. Your inner dialogue is malleable. It's not a fixed program running inside you. It's a tool you can sharpen, and the sharper it becomes, the clearer you'll see yourself, your strengths, and the path forward. Chapter 2. The Body as an Instrument. How posture changes your inner self. Most people think that self-confidence is something that works from the inside out. First I feel confident, then I appear confident. That's true, but it's only half the story, because the body isn't a passive expression of your inner state. It's an active participant in shaping it. The Stoics viewed human beings as a unity. Body, mind, and reason interact. What you do with your body influences what you think, and what you think influences how you move. This isn't a philosophy of convenience. It's reality, confirmed by modern science today. When you feel insecure, your body immediately expresses this. Your shoulders slump forward, your chest contracts, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, your head tilts slightly downward. These physical signals send information back to the brain, and the brain interprets them as confirmation of danger. It switches into defense mode. Your thoughts narrow and your access to creativity and clarity diminishes. But it also works the other way around. If you consciously straighten up, open your shoulders, breathe deeply into your belly, and calmly look straight ahead, your body sends a different signal. Your nervous system calms down, your hormone levels shift, your brain receives the message, everything is okay, I'm ready. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a tired body need not hinder the mind if the mind has decided to remain upright. But the reverse is equally true. An upright body can give stability to a wavering mind. Try it. Before your next important conversation, be it a job interview, a difficult phone call, or a meeting you're dreading, pause for a moment. Stand upright, both feet firmly on the ground, shoulders back and slightly open, chin parallel to the floor, eyes straight ahead. Then breathe consciously. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold briefly, exhale for 6. Just these 30 seconds will change your physiological state, and thus your entire demeanor. This isn't a pose. This is control. You're taking control of what you can influence, your body, your breath, your posture, and therein lies Stoic wisdom. Not trying to change the external world, but putting your own inner self in order. Over time, this attitude will become a habit. You won't have to think about it anymore. Your body will learn that honesty is its normal state. And with it, your mind will learn that clarity isn't a rare gift, but something you create anew each day. Chapter 3. The Art of Preparation. How to turn uncertainty into truth. The most effective principles has a long Latin name, but a simple meaning. Premeditatio malorum. The anticipatory consideration of potential difficulties. Not pessimism, not catastrophizing, but rather mental preparation for what might come, so that you remain clear-headed when things get serious. Most people avoid this thought. They don't want to think about the bad, because they believe they'll invite it. But the Stoics thought differently. Those who mentally confront challenges before they arise aren't more fearful. They're freer, because they weren't caught off guard. They're prepared. Imagine you're going to an important meeting that you haven't properly prepared for. Your mind is full of unanswered questions. What will I say if they ask that? What if I don't know the answer? What if it gets uncomfortable? These unanswered questions create anxiety because they have no solutions. Your nervous system is on high alert, with no way out. Now, the same scenario, but with preparation. You've taken time beforehand to think through potentially difficult moments. What could go wrong? And what would be my calm, clear response? If I can't answer a question, I'll say so openly and show my willingness to follow up. If the conversation gets heated, I'll take a deep breath before answering. This mental preparation gives you something priceless, inner peace. Epictetus said, "He who prepares for what might happen will never be surprised." This is not a guarantee that everything will go well. It is a guarantee that you can handle whatever comes your way. And this inner certainty, I can handle it, is the foundation of true self-confidence. Preparation doesn't mean control. You can never control how a conversation unfolds, how others react, or what life brings next. But you can prepare your inner response. And that's enough. Make this a practice. Take 5 minutes each day and ask yourself, what challenge do I face today or this week? What might be difficult? And how would I handle it calmly and clearly? Write down the answers, read them through. This simple practice will change your inner attitude, from fear of the unknown to trust in yourself. People who are prepared seem different, not because they know everything, but because they know they can handle anything. This difference is palpable. It's evident in the calmness of their voice, the openness of their gaze, the way they breathe when things get tight. Preparation isn't a sign of weakness or over-anxiety, it's a sign of seriousness. And taking things seriously is the foundation upon which self-confidence grows. Chapter 4. Regaining Control. The Stoic Principle of the Two Spheres. There is one question that can change everything if you take it seriously. Is what is currently stressing me out within my power, or not? Epictetus opened his most important work, the Enchiridion, with precisely this idea. He divided the world into two realms, that which is within our power, our thoughts, our decisions, our attitudes, and that which is not within our power, the behavior of others, the judgment of the world, the course of external events. This distinction is not merely philosophically interesting, it is practically life-changing. Most people spend a large portion of their energy in the second area. They try to control how others perceive them. They fight against opinions they cannot change. They exhaust themselves trying to appear perfect so that no one thinks the wrong thing. The result is strength. It is chronic exhaustion, and beneath this exhaustion, self-confidence disappears. Herein lies the Stoic liberation. When you realize you cannot control the judgment of others and stop trying, your energy flows to where it truly works, within yourself, into your preparation, into your attitude, into the way you speak to and act towards yourself. Stay with me because this next thought is crucial. Self-confidence that depends on what others think is not true self-confidence. It's approval dependent. True self-confidence, on the other hand, rests on an inner foundation, on clarity about what you can do and acceptance of what you cannot control. Imagine a difficult conversation. You can choose your tone of voice, think through your words, and consciously maintain your posture. But you can't control how the other person reacts. If you try to control their reaction as well, you'll become increasingly nervous the less they react as you hoped. If you focus on what's within your control, your clarity, your calmness, your expression, you'll remain centered regardless of the response. This is not a passive stance, it is the opposite. It is an active decision. I use my energy where it has an impact, and I let go of what is outside my sphere of influence, not out of indifference, but out of wisdom. Start today. The next time you notice yourself feeling tense, pause for a moment and ask yourself, is this within my control? If yes, act. If no, let go. Sounds simple, but with practice it becomes second nature. And when that happens, your entire inner experience changes. You won't become more reckless, you'll become freer. Chapter 5. Authenticity as a Strength. Why authenticity is more convincing than perfection. There is a type of person who fills every room without being loud, who inspires trust effortlessly, who makes others feel truly heard. This person doesn't play a role. They are simply themselves, complete, authentic, without hesitation. That is authenticity, and it is the most effective form of self-confidence there is. In our time, perfection is an ideal that's marketed everywhere. Perfect skin, perfect answers, perfect performances. But the problem with perfection is, it doesn't convince anyone. People immediately sense when someone is wearing a mask. We're trained to recognize authenticity evolutionarily, neurologically, socially. A well-acted facade might impress briefly, but it doesn't create a genuine connection. It leaves no lasting impression. Seneca wrote, "If you know who you are, you have nothing to fear." This sentence contains the whole truth about authenticity. Those who know themselves and stand by their convictions have no Achilles heel that could be judged by others. For what others might criticize, they have already evaluated and accepted for themselves. This doesn't mean having no weaknesses. It means knowing them and not letting them hide you. A person who openly says, "I'm still learning in this area," doesn't come across as weak. They come across as credible. And credibility is the strongest form of authority. Ask yourself, in what moments are you playing a role? When do you outwardly present something different from what you feel inside? Not to criticize yourself, but to look honestly, because often we don't even realize we're wearing a mask anymore. It's become so habitual that it feels like a second face. The Stoic practice here is self-knowledge, not self-criticism, not self-condemnation, but clear, calm introspection. Who am I really when no one is watching? What values guide me? What do I defend, even when it's uncomfortable? If you can answer these questions, you possess something rare. An inner identity that doesn't depend on applause. And people who possess this have a magnetic effect on others, not because they are perfect, but because they are real. In a world completely saturated with staged performances, authenticity is the rarest and most coveted thing there is. Chapter 6. The Power of Imperfection. How mistakes strengthen you instead of weakening you. Perfectionism is one of the most insidious forms of self-punishment. It disguises itself as high standards, ambition, a commitment to quality. But in reality, it's often something else. The fear of being seen. The fear that someone will realize you don't know everything, that you're wrong, that you'll fail. This fear is paralyzing. It prevents people from trying things, starting conversations, sharing ideas. It creates an internal climate in which progress is hardly possible, because every possible step is viewed through the microscope of one's own judgment. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man of his time and one of the most profound Stoic thinkers, repeatedly wrote about his own mistakes in his diaries. Openly, without embellishment, without self-flagellation. He recorded them, not as proof of his inadequacy, but as material for his development. This is the Stoic relationship to mistakes. They are information, not judgments. When you make a mistake, there are two paths. The first, you make it your identity. You tell yourself, I am someone who makes mistakes. I am unreliable, incompetent, weak. This path leads to stagnation. The second, you turn the mistake into a lesson. You ask, what can I learn from this? What would be better next time? And then you move on. This path leads to growth. Imperfection makes you human, and that's precisely what creates connection. No one finds a flawless person appealing. We find them cold, unapproachable, elusive. What truly attracts us is the combination of strength and vulnerability. The person who openly acknowledges their insecurities and yet still takes action. Who admits mistakes and still stands up for their point of view. Who isn't perfect, but is sincere. This is the Stoic attitude. Not striving for perfection, but being able to deal clearly with mistakes. And in this clarity lies a form of dignity that no mask can achieve. So permission to be imperfect, not as an excuse for negligence, but as liberation from the pressure to be something no one ever truly is. You don't have to know everything. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to stumble, as long as you get up. And every time you get up, a little more of what constitutes true self-confidence grows. Chapter 7. Silence as a tool. How breath and presence anchor you in the middle of a heated conversation, in the middle of a situation spiraling out of control, in the very moment when you desperately want to escape. That's precisely when the ability to pause is most valuable. Seneca wrote that wisdom often has more to do with silence than with words. In a world that rewards speed, this is a revolutionary statement. Most people immediately fill silence with speech, explanations, and reactions. Not because they have something important to say, but because they cannot bear the silence. And this reflex reveals more than any answer. A person who can be silent, who allows for a pause, who breathes before answering, who doesn't immediately react to every challenge. This person appears different. They appear thoughtful, grounded, at peace within themselves. And this effect isn't a technique. It's the result of genuine inner work. Your breath is the most direct tool you have. It's always with you. It costs nothing. And it's the fastest way to calm your nervous system and bring your attention back to the present moment. Here's a method you can use immediately. Inhale through your nose while counting to 4. Hold briefly. Then exhale slowly through your mouth while counting to 6 or 7. Repeat this 3 times before entering a difficult situation or in the middle of one. If you notice you're starting to lose control, this simple exercise will change your physiological state within seconds. It's not a trick, it's biology. But silence is more than just breathing technique. It's an inner attitude, the willingness not to react immediately, the ability to be present without having to act right away. This quality develops through practice, through moments when you consciously refrain from filling the silence. When you pause, even when it becomes uncomfortable. Stoic presence means being fully in the moment without being distracted by the past or the future. Yesterday's worries and tomorrow's anxieties have no place in this moment. There is only now, this conversation, this task. And in this focus lies a power that is extraordinary. If you don't fear silence, you won't fear most other things either. Because behind silence lies trust in yourself, in your judgment, in your ability to deal with what comes. Chapter 8. Acting despite fear. Why courage arises through movement. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Waiting won't make it better. You won't wake up one day feeling ready. The trembling won't stop until you begin. The fear won't disappear until you take the first step. Because courage isn't a feeling that precedes action. Courage is what arises from action. The Stoics knew this. Musonius Rufus, one of the lesser-known but exceptionally insightful Stoics, put it perfectly: it is not theory that makes a person strong, but lived experience. You can read all the books on self-confidence, study all the theories on inner strength, and still hesitate when it comes down to it. Knowledge only becomes power when it is tested in action. Epictetus said, "If you truly want to win, practice like a winner. Don't just feel like a winner, act like one." That is the crucial difference. Action produces proof, and proof builds confidence. Think of a moment when you did something despite being nervous. Had a difficult conversation, made a decision, stepped onto a stage. What did you feel afterward? Not the triumph of external success, but something deeper, the certainty that you had done it, that you hadn't let anything hold you back. This inner certainty is the stuff of which true self-confidence is made. Every moment you act despite doubt adds a new chapter to your inner story. You begin to believe yourself, not because someone else told you so, but because you've proven it to yourself. That is irreplaceable. Where are you hesitating right now? Which conversation are you putting off? Which decision is waiting because the timing isn't perfect yet? What would happen if you took just one small step today? Not the perfect step, any step. Because clarity comes from movement, clarity that never comes from standing still. The fear of embarrassment, failure, of rejection, all of that loses its power the moment you take action. Not because the fear disappears, but because you become greater than it. Action is proof that you are not controlled by it, and this proof changes your self-image permanently from the inside out. Chapter 9. Sovereign in Conversations. How Stoicism gives you social freedom. The paradox of social situations is this: the more you try to make a certain impression, the less successful you become. People who desperately want to be liked try to fit in, and in doing so, seem strangely inauthentic. People who want to prove how competent they are talk too much and appear insecure. The attempt itself sabotages the outcome. The Stoic way is radically different. Instead of asking, "What do others think of me?" you ask yourself, "Am I being honest with myself right now? Am I acting in accordance with my values?" This shift from the outside to the inside is the secret to social sovereignty. This becomes clear in conversations. Someone who is internally stable doesn't need to control the other person's reaction. They don't have to prove anything, convince anyone, or defend themselves. They are simply present. They listen, truly listen, not just to prepare a response, but to understand. And this quality of genuine listening is exceptionally rare. It is felt, even if no one can put their finger on it. Seneca wrote, "Speak less than you could and more than you must." In a time when everyone immediately has an opinion, a reaction, an answer ready, restraint is a form of strength. Not passivity, but conscious choice. You speak when you have something genuine to contribute, and you remain silent when silence is wiser. Criticism is a unique test of Stoic sovereignty. When someone criticizes you, there are two possibilities. Either they are right, in which case criticism is a gift, and you can grow, or they are wrong, in which case their criticism reveals more about them than about you, and you don't need to react. Epictetus expressed it precisely this way, and in this attitude lies an incredible liberation. You don't have to defend yourself. You can listen, reflect, and then decide for yourself. In heated moments, a single Stoic thought helps. I'm not here to win, I'm here to be clear. This sentence takes the fight out of you. It reminds you that it's not about dominance, but about connection. And there is more strength in connection than in any verbal victory. Strength in conversation doesn't come from loud words or impressive arguments. It comes from presence, from calmness, from the willingness to listen and not to immediately justify oneself. That's the Stoic way of being among people, clear, sincere, and completely at one with oneself. Chapter 10. Self-image as a foundation. How daily self-respect will sustain you in the long term. Everything we have discussed so far, the inner dialogue, the posture, the preparation, the control of the controllable, the authenticity, all of this depends on a single foundation, the image you have of yourself. Your self-image isn't what others think of you. It's what you know about yourself deep down. It's the silent commentary that runs through your mind when you're alone at night. It's the question of whether you trust yourself when no one is watching. And it's the answer to that question that determines how you go out into the world. Musonius Rufus said, "He who respects himself does not seek what is pleasant, he seeks what is right." Self-respect is not self-love in the sense of narcissism. It is the serious commitment to be true to yourself, to do what you believe is right, to take your own words seriously, to keep the promises you make to yourself. That sounds obvious, but how often do you make an exception just for yourself? How often do you tell yourself, "Not today, I'll start tomorrow"? How often do you break your own word to yourself and barely notice what that does to your self-image? Every broken promise you make to yourself is a small crack in your inner foundation, not dramatic, not irreparable, but cumulative. And conversely, the same is true. Every promise kept, every small decision in line with your values, every time you do the right thing even if no one sees it, all of this strengthens your inner core. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not treat yourself as an enemy." This sentence has more depth than it initially appears. Many people are their own harshest critics. They allow themselves no mistakes, no pauses, no uncertainty. They punish themselves with thoughts they would never express to another human being. That is not strength, that is inner exhaustion. Self-compassion is not a weakness. It's the ability to treat yourself with the same kindness you would show a good friend. This doesn't mean excusing mistakes or letting go of expectations. It means treating yourself like a person you respect. When you do this, when you start taking yourself seriously, living your values, and being honest with yourself, something changes. Not overnight, but noticeably and permanently. You become more stable. You become less dependent on external validation. You no longer have to start from scratch every morning, trying to prove to yourself that you're good enough, because you know it. From within, from your own experience, that's true self-confidence. No technique, no performance, no persuasion, just the calm, clear certainty. I stand by myself. Final thoughts. Self-confidence is not a quality, it is a practice. We've reached the end of this audio book. But in reality, you're just at the beginning, because everything discussed here is only as valuable as how you integrate it into your daily life. Self-confidence isn't a state you reach and then possess. It's a daily decision. The decision to be honest with yourself. The decision to stand up straight, even when you don't feel like it. The decision to act, even when doubts are present. The decision to stand by yourself, even when no one applauds. The Stoics left us a philosophy that consists not of abstractions, but of practice, of the daily struggle with oneself, of looking honestly in the mirror, of the courage to do the right thing because it is right, not because it is easy or because it brings applause. If this audiobook touched you in any way, it wasn't because the words were perfect, but because they spoke to something inside you that has always been there. A part of you knows you are more than your doubts. A part of you knows you are stronger than you often believe. That part deserves to be heard. If you found this content helpful, we'd be delighted if you subscribed to Stoic Vision and turned on notifications. Here we explore the wisdom of Stoicism each week for greater clarity, inner strength, and a life grounded in true values. Your comments mean a lot to us. Until next time, stay true yourself.